What's up everybody? So in this video, I'm going to be making a nice summary video on what you need to know regarding membrane transport. So let's just get into it. Now remember, just like this little guy here, we are made up of billions of cells, right? Billions of cells, and I've said this so many times. Now, what is this thing surrounding a cell? We call this a membrane. Remember, a membrane. Now, a membrane's main function is to control what goes in and what goes out of a cell. It's like the wall controlling that, okay? Now, there are various ways by which molecules can enter and leave a cell. There's not just one way. There are many ways. It's just like in real life. There's not only, walking is not the only way by which you transport. You can transport by Lamborghini, by ship, by bus, by running, by parachute, whatever. There's so many ways to transport, right? That's the same thing in our cells with molecules. There's many different ways by which they can transport. And they include simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and all of these, right? So these five you really need to know. Now, I've made a video where I talked about each of these individually in their own separate video, so you really got to check that out. This video is really just to have a quick summary, a quick recap, basically, in case you forgot a little bit of stuff. But if you really want to get it, you got to watch these videos. I really recommend. So let's get into it. So let's make a quick summary. So when we think about membrane transport, you got to ask yourself three things. Does this specific method need a channel? A protein channel? Does it need a concentration gradient? And three, does it need ATP? You got to ask yourself these three questions for every single method. Okay, that's exactly what we're going to do now. If you know these things, you pretty much know what you need to know. So we're going to go through all of these methods and tick or cross whatever these three things are for them. So here we have it. Okay, so let's start off with passive transport. So passive transport, as you can see here, is going to be these three green ones. And you'll see why they're called passive transport. Okay, so the three types of passive transport is simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Now, why are they called passive? Because they require no energy. They do not require ATP. They don't need energy. Passive means to be effortless. They're effortless. And if they're effortless, it means they happen naturally. They don't need, your cell doesn't need to spend its ATP, doesn't need to spend its money to make it happen. They happen naturally. So, why do they happen naturally? The reason why all of these three methods happen naturally is because they need a concentration gradient. That means that whatever molecule you're trying to move, the only way that they'll move through one of these mechanisms is if there's a concentration gradient, meaning one side of the membrane has a lot of this molecule, and the other side has a very small concentration of this molecule. So, naturally, this molecule wants to even both sides out and move from the side that has a lot of it to the side that has a little of it, moving down the concentration gradient, right? So that happens naturally. That does not require ATP. So that's why. So it doesn't require ATP because there's a concentration gradient already. Now, depending on which type, they may or may not need a membrane protein. So for example, the first one absolutely does not need a membrane protein. This one happens through the phospholipid bilayer. So it happens like here. Now I had a picture here. It happens like here. It doesn't need this protein at all. Why? Because molecules that travel by simple diffusion are super tiny, meaning they can actually fit through this phospholipids and go from one side to the other without needing this protein, because this protein is useful for bigger molecules, right? So that's why simple diffusion is only applicable to small molecules. And another thing you need to know, very important, is that that's not the only reason. Size is not the only reason. Some molecules are hydrophobic, meaning they are okay with being in an environment where there's no water. So other molecules that travel by simple diffusion are hydrophobic molecules, meaning as they come from this side and they travel and get into this part here, which is hydrophobic, as you know, they don't just jump back out because they're okay with being in this environment. So they can go in, be okay with it, and come out the other side. Whereas hydrophilic molecules that love water, as soon as they get into this area that's hydrophobic, they just jump back out. So they cannot cross using the phospholipid bilayer. They need this protein because this protein is in contact with the water from the outside of the cell and the water from the inside of the cell. So when these molecules that are hydrophilic, water-loving, cannot pass through here because they keep bouncing back, they are okay with going through this channel here because this channel has water in it. allowing hydrophilic and bigger molecules to travel from one side to the other, right? So ultimately, that's why simple diffusion does not need a protein, because it's for small and hydrophobic molecules, right? So what about facilitated? Facilitated diffusion needs a protein. Absolutely needs a protein. It can use either this protein or that protein. Either one is fine. Either one is fine, right? So facilitated diffusion would be for molecules that are, unlike simple diffusion, these molecules will be a bit bigger, and because they don't fit through the membrane, or they will be hydrophilic, meaning they like water, so they cannot pass through this membrane, like simple diffusion does. Now the last one here for passive transport is osmosis. So osmosis is the transport of water. Both of these, simple and facilitated, was the transport of molecules across a membrane, not water. So substances other than water. So osmosis is the traveling of water, right? And so this one also needs a channel protein, because water is, well, guess what? Water likes water. So as soon as water comes in this area with no water, it's going to jump back out. And so it needs this protein to travel through. So just like the other ones. So it needs this one. And it's specifically the protein that you need to know about is aquaporin. It's a protein that is a channel protein specifically made for water. Okay. Now, so that's it for passive transport. These do not require energy. Active transport is a way of transport across the membrane that requires energy. Let me show you. It requires energy. It requires ATP. What types of active transport are there? Just one. You only need to know about active transport. There's no subtypes of this one. It's just active transport. It's one category. So it requires energy. Why? Because these molecules want to move against their concentration gradient. So unlike here in passive transport, where the molecules were able to move down their concentration gradient from an area of a lot to an area of a little, you can think of it like a crowd. If you're in a crowded room, it's much easier to leave the room to an area where there's fewer people than to come into this crowded room, right? That's a good analogy to think of it. So it's the same thing here. It requires energy to go into the crowd from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration, unlike passive transport. Now, active transport always needs a protein carrier. Because, why? Because these molecules don't naturally want to move against their concentration gradient, right? So something needs to drag them across. So you need a protein called a carrier protein that looks like this. So it's this one. It is a protein that's going to physically grab this molecule and force it to come to the other side, because this process is not natural, right? It doesn't want to happen naturally, so we got to force it. And so ATP is going to go to this carrier protein and kind of shock it, make it work. It's going to turn it on like a key. And then once it's turned on with energy, with this ATP, it can carry this molecule across, make it move to the other side, dragging it, right? It's like a child who doesn't want to do anything. You got to drag them to where they got to go, right? So that's why it requires energy, because there's no concentration gradient, and therefore you need this protein to do it. So those are the two main ones, passive transport and active transport. There's this one outlier that doesn't really fit in passive or active transport, so we made a separate category. It's called endocytosis and exocytosis, right? So again, this one doesn't have its own category. It is these two, endocytosis and exocytosis. Now this one does not need a protein, because this method carries humongous molecules. And if you don't know what endocytosis and exocytosis is, you got to check out my video. But basically, it's when the cell membrane folds around a molecule and engulfs it completely. So the molecule doesn't travel through the membrane, the cell eats it, physically eats it. And you got to check out the video to see what I mean by that. But for that, it doesn't need a membrane. It just needs the cell wall itself, the cell membrane itself. No proteins needed. And this does not need a concentration gradient either. For endocytosis and exocytosis, it's basically a method to move really, really, really big molecules, okay? Because you got to engulf them. They're so big that they can't travel through the membrane without a protein or through the membrane with a protein. So you have to physically eat it. The cell has to eat it. And so it eats either really big molecules, or it eats like 10 molecules at once, 10 different smaller molecules at once. So it kind of eats. It's a way of moving many things, like kind of like bulk eating. And so this one also needs ATP. The membrane doesn't eat or make this motion of engulfing something without energy. It needs energy to make that happen. It needs ATP to make the cell be able to do that. So right here is some conclusions that you can read. And really, that's it for what you need to know.